Russia's war on Ukraine is pushing the world's most vulnerable countries into a food security crisis. Many of these states are in Africa, which rely heavily on Russia and Ukraine for wheat, fertilizer and vegetable oil imports. Earlier this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy told the African Union the situation is catastrophic.
Africa is actually a hostage. It is a hostage of those who unleashed war against our state. If it wasn't for the Russian war, people in Africa, people in Asia and elsewhere in the world would not suffer from the catastrophic rise in food prices.
Well, the fighting has disrupted global commodity markets and trade to the African continent, raising food prices and creating more shortages. As world leaders gather in Germany to address the looming global hunger crisis, we'll find out what can be done to make African nations more self-sufficient. But first, we go to Darfur in Western Sudan, where there's an urgent need to alleviate growing hunger.
There's food, but hardly any customers. People here in eastern Darfur simply can't afford what's on offer. Even before the war in Ukraine, prices here increased by 700%. This year, prices jumped again by another 200%. For millions in Sudan and across sub-Saharan Africa, the situation is becoming unbearable.
Since last year, the UN have stopped the food distribution to us. More than 75% of the people in this camp have been left out of the UN system. The few people who still get food aid have their rations cut by 20%.
Salva was first displaced by the war in Darfur in 2006. Her and her family walked for months to get to safety here in this camp in eastern Darfur. Since then, she and her 5 children have all been dependent on food handouts. But in the last few months, this aid has almost dried up.
My message to the international community: if they really know the meaning of human beings, they should provide food to everyone who is affected by war. And we need peace and security.
In both East and West Darfur, most aid agencies have stopped their work completely. The only aid arriving is for emergencies, like here in Krenek after a recent deadly attack. The war in Ukraine has forced the UN and other agencies to even cut this help by more than half. For Salva and her family, this means they and millions of others in Sudan now face a devastating future.
For more on this, I'm joined by Carlos Lopez. He is a professor at the University of Cape Town. It's good to have you with us here on DW News Africa. Now, how concerning is food insecurity for African nations right now, given the war in Ukraine?
Well, some countries more than others, but in general, Africa imports about $35 billion worth of food every year, and a lot of it comes from Russia and Ukraine when it refers to cereals, with countries like Egypt, Somalia, Sudan, Tanzania, and also Senegal having a very large dependency on food imports from that part of the world.
But why is the continent so dependent on these imports when it's said to have about 60% of the world's unused arable land?
Well, it's a combination of factors. I think the most important is that we have treated agriculture as a social area, not as an economic opportunity. And the policies that have been put in place by both the countries and the donors to deal with the primary sector have been very much reliable on how to address issues of resilience, vulnerabilities, poverty reduction, but not necessarily transformative in terms of increasing the yields per hectare, increasing productivity, and making sure that African agriculture is modernized and benefits from technology like irrigation.
So when you say looking at investing in agriculture might be the way forward for Africa, is there enough investment and political will to achieve this, though?
Well, we need much more because the access to finance is a major constraint for African economies in general. They pay more than the rest of the world in terms of sovereign debt and also access to commercial debt in general, partly because of the evaluation of risk in Africa being unfair for the same macro indicators, treating Africa with a premium of risk that is not justified. And partly also because the economic policy of the African countries has been oriented towards exporting commodities that are producing rent for the elites rather than actually dealing with the rest of the economy, and partly also because of the levels of informality being so high. So unless we address these issues comprehensively, it's not possible really to have the kind of transformation that is required.
What can the international community do to step up its support to African nations now to ensure that there is affordable food access and it's sustainable and self-sufficient for them?
Stop treating Africa just when there is a crisis, like now there is a crisis of drought, apart from the crisis provoked by the inflation and the lack of access to food from Ukraine and Russia. We need to deal with the issues in a structural manner, not with the short-term vision, as it has been mostly the case. And we need to stop this food security interpretation that is dealing basically with immediate needs rather than introducing the changes that are required for agriculture to be very much part of the growth story in Africa. We have about 23% of Africa's GDP that depends on the primary sector. The potential for increasing that is quite immense. And when you know that the first line of consumption of people that leave the poverty line is actually to consume food, and when you know that Africa has a level of urbanization that is increasing very fast, about 50% of the population right now, you need to tackle these issues in a completely different manner from what has been the case so far.
Okay, Carlos Lopez speaking to us from Cape Town. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
And South Africa is also feeling the effects of the war in Ukraine. The COVID-19 pandemic already triggered a growing economic crisis. And now, surging food prices and unemployment is forcing many into homelessness. But one centre is trying to keep people off the streets. DW's Adrian Krish has a story from Cape Town.
Thank you very much for the food.
Queuing up for food handed out by a charity for homeless people in the middle of Cape Town. Simi Engelbrecht hasn't had a warm meal for a long time. She's been living on the streets for more than 4 years.
I come to a point whereby I hate it because there's no way that you can move forward in life. There's no way that you can build yourself up in life while you're still on the streets. Because I tried it many times, which it didn't work.
Engelbrecht is not alone, and since the pandemic hit, even more people have been forced to live on the street.
Camps and makeshift shelters like this have been mushrooming in the city of Cape Town. There are about 7,000 homeless people in the city, much more than before lockdown.
The city runs a Safe Place program for homeless people, but currently there are only about 50 free spaces available each night. The rest is occupied. Cape Town wants to create hundreds of additional spaces, but the mayor says the lack of support from the national government makes it impossible to solve the problem.
The core of the problem here is that the healthcare system is not capacitated enough to deal with the scale of this problem. We are picking up the pieces at the end of this, all of these other failures. There's been a poverty failure, there's been a domestic violence failure often that the system has not coped with. There has been a mental breakdown failure and then a substance abuse failure.
Along with the rise in homelessness, South Africa is also dealing with an unemployment crisis. Every third person here is jobless. Now rising costs of living driven by the war in Ukraine are making things worse for everyone. Cooking oil has gone up by almost 50%, fuel by 20%.
It does affect everyone because, as you know, it affects the prices of the basic commodities in the shops. But now the salaries of people are not going up.
People can't live like this anymore. It's crazy. It's chaos. We are in a chaos world now. In the state we're living in, the prices are just going up and up and up.
The government has acknowledged the problem but has failed to provide a solution amid a shortage of funds.
In recent times, we are having to deal with another problem, which is the rising cost of living has made it increasingly difficult for the majority of our people to get by and to pay their bills and also to feed their children.
Simi Engelbrecht is relieved that she doesn't need to worry about food, at least for today. But tomorrow, her daily struggle continues.